Hi, you're listening to The Dive, brought to you by Living Word Press, starting right now. Hi, welcome back to The Dive. I'm back with Dr. Josh Waldman, Dr. Gary Yates, and we've been dancing around this question for a couple weeks now. We're now in part 3 of the Canaanite conquest, and I think you guys are actually going to finally give us an answer.
I don't know. We could punt it down the road a little ways.
Yeah. Eventually, the proof's in the pudding, so you got to come up with something. So we're going to try to a little bit here.
The original question was, why did God, order this Canaanite conquest, and specifically all the violence that went along with it? First week we did, can God commit an evil act? And then last week we looked at some of the bad answers, maybe.
Yeah.
What are some of the good answers?
Yeah, I like the way you put that. So, I thought we'd maybe start with a couple of passages here, and then I'll let Gary wax poetic here for, the rest of the episode. But here's Deuteronomy chapter 7, and there's several passages that we would sort of lump into this issue, but this has got a concise sort of set of descriptors here. So Deuteronomy 7, when the Lord your God brings you into the land you are entering to possess, and he drives out the many nations before you, and when the Lord your God delivers them over to you and you defeat them, you must completely destroy them, make no treaty with them, and show them no mercy. And that's kind of the language we get here. No treaty, no mercy. Again, I like the title there. Maybe that needs to be the title of this episode. No treaty, no mercy. But what do we do with that? Is this, first and foremost, is this hyperbolic language? Do we mean absolutely no treaty and no mercy? Wipe them out. God's anger, says the Lord's anger will burn against you, and he will swiftly destroy you if you were to intermarry with them and all this kind of stuff. Are we talking about hyperbolic language, or is this literal?
Well, I think there are several things about the language of the conquest, the story of Joshua, that really are issues that we do have to discuss. And I do think that there are hyperbolic, there's war language, and we'll talk about some examples of those. You really have this somewhat even in the book of Joshua, where it'll say there were no survivors, they wiped out everyone, and then the next chapter it will say, well, the problem was they didn't drive out all the Canaanites, and we're like, well, what exactly is going on here? And so some knowledge of war language and some of the ways that the story is told, are definitely part of this discussion. And part of what I think is kind of fun about all this, but I think, initially, we need to start just by talking about, well, what exactly was the rationale for why God, was targeting the Canaanites for judgment? And I think really there's really 4 or 5 things that almost come together here. The first one is, and this is, for those of us who, accept the God of the Bible, it's the idea that the Canaanites were a wicked, sinful, immoral people, and God had determined that it was time that they were to be judged, as a society, as a culture. And, God is the creator, God is the judge. It says in Psalm 11 that his eyes look and examine all humans. We know that throughout history, God judges nations. The Noahic covenant, I think, provides the rationale and the basis for this. And the Canaanites, by virtue of their immorality and their religious practices, even some of their violence, they are more than deserving of this judgment.
Yeah, what are we talking about when we say a wicked nation? America in some ways is a wicked nation. So what are we talking about here that makes this so much worse? Would we use the language worse?
Yeah, and I think I'm not sure that I would use the language worse.
Okay.
Because the idea is not, well, God commanded the Israelites to do this because they were the worst people on the face of the earth. If you were to, somehow be able to be transported back to the ancient Near East, they really, I'm not sure the Canaanites would be that much different than, all of these other, groups of people that we see in some ways, we might have a hard time even distinguishing the Israelites at times from the way they, they often Canaanize themselves. So I don't think it's helpful to say that God was judging the Canaanites because they were the worst people on the face of the earth. And I think we do have to realize sometimes that the biblical portrayal of them is it's very pejorative and those type. If you were to go back and, for example, I think read certain Canaanite texts and things like, they would espouse the ideas of, caring for widows and orphans and the poor and those kinds of things. They weren't just a wicked and depraved people, but there are plenty of evidences, like their religious practices, the debauchery, like sexual perversion that gets brought into some of that. I remember, translating some of these Canaanite texts when we took Ugaritic, and literally some of their texts that would talk about their gods were pornographic.
Yeah.
We think we invented that stuff, but it's wicked and depraved. There's sexual aspects in their religion and those types of things. In some of the Canaanite stories, like for example, El, who is sort of the head god, he's immoral. He murders his son, his daughter. He's a drunk, and you become what you worship. Mm-hmm. So I think a part of this is that their wickedness is there, and then but also along with that, it's their proximity to Israel.
Right.
Number one, they're in the land that God had promised to give to Israel. They can't just pass a flyer out and say, "Hey, the Lord has given us possession of this land." And remember, they had been given possession of this back in the book of Genesis, and had to leave. So the Canaanites are, well, yeah, good, we'll be out by Wednesday or that sort of thing. So part of it is that God is fulfilling this promise that He made to Israel. God promised to Abraham, "I'm going to give this land to you and your descendants." And I think the way that the judgment of the Canaanites is being juxtaposed to God saying, now I'm going to fulfill that covenant promise. But also along with that is that if the Canaanites are there, and their proximity to Israel is the issue, because their religious practices and their moral perversions and those kinds of things, that's going to influence Israel. And so it's the fact that they're living among where the Israelites are going to live, that's part of the reason why they need to be dealt with. And ultimately we think about the importance of God preserving Israel as His people.
Yep.
That's where Messiah is going to come
Salvation
from.
history is part of the context.
Yeah.
Here.
So the judgment of the Canaanites in some ways is necessary so that God's plan of salvation to show mercy to all of humanity for all time. That's part of what's being factored into all this.
Yeah, and for me too, when you hear this kind of, okay, God is showing favor to the Israelites to go into the land. He's going to kick the Canaanites out of the land because of their sinfulness, and He's judging them in that regard. It's not like God doesn't judge the Israelites for their sinfulness. In fact, by some of the same kinds of people that worship the same kinds of false gods at times, right? So
yeah.
It's not like God is not even-handed in his judgment in this way.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the problem with the whole language of genocide.
Right.
That this has nothing to do with the Canaanites' ethnic background. And in fact, the term Canaanite sometimes is used for all the residents of the land, and other times it's for a specific group of people within the land. But the same punishments that God brings against the Canaanites, when Israel turns around, commits the same sins, worships the same gods, follows the same religious practices. 2 Kings chapter 17 even uses the same language. God will drive out the Israelites in the same way that He drove out the Canaanites. And so the language of holy war gets applied to the Israelites. Jeremiah 21, God is no longer fighting with the Israelites. He's wearing he's playing for the Yankees now. He's wearing a Babylonian, and he's leading the armies that assault the city of Israel or Jerusalem. So the same language of judgment is applied to God's own people. It's not just an ethnic purge of these Canaanite peoples.
All right, so you were talking about, you had like 4 sort of reasons
Yeah.
there, and I think you got through a few of them. I just
Yeah.
want to make sure you have a chance to circle back.
Well, let me circle back to just a couple of things about the whole the wickedness of the Canaanites and that sort of thing. I think we've covered 3 things, so far. They were deserving of judgment, and God in His sovereignty, not that they were the worst people, but God in His sovereignty determined that this was the time. It was also the way that the promise that God had made to Israel about the land would be fulfilled. And one thing I was going to bring out about this is that God was back in the book of Genesis. He says in Genesis 15:16, he says, the sins of the Amorites is not yet full. And so God delayed the judgment of the Canaanites for 400 years, allowing them to have an opportunity to repent and turn from their sinful ways. And he ended up forcing his own people to live as slaves and to be homeless. I'm going to force my own people to be slaves and homeless because I'm going to give these people a
chance.
So yeah, it's not just an angry, vengeful God. Look at the chances that he gave them. And I would say God was doing the same thing for the Egyptians. He's giving them time. Their sins are not yet full, but when they, reach this arrogance and oppression of the Israelites, judgment's going to come as a result of that. And part of just this idea of the wickedness of the Canaanites, going back to the book of Genesis, just remember a few of the things that are said about, the wickedness of the people that are in the land during the days of the patriarch. You have the city of Sodom and Gomorrah, which in many ways is it's the paragon city of wickedness and evil, and not just immorality, but homosexual rape and those types of things occurring. And then Canaanite violence and sinfulness even goes back to the story of the curse of Noah's son. And we always wonder, Ham was the one that looked on his father's nakedness, and Canaan is the one that gets cursed. Well, I think it's simply just because Canaan will reflect the immoral attributes of his whatever Ham did, and that's another podcast. Canaanite evil goes all the way back to the days of Ham, and so there's been a long time where God has been patiently waiting to do this. I think there's a couple of other things, and one thing that I was going to mention is part of this. You have to also sort of put yourself in the mindset of the theology of the Old Testament, where in Exodus 15:17, for example, the promised land will be God's sanctuary. So it's like the land itself is sacred space. God will live among his people, and so the whole land is like a temple. Well, when Israel builds the tabernacle and temple, what does God tell them? Nothing that is unclean, nothing that is unholy is to come into my presence. And, if you come into my presence unclean and unholy, you can die.
Yep.
So in the theology of the Old Testament, if the Holy Land is sacred space, then the Canaanites cannot be there in the presence of God. They have to be driven out. And so they're, the whole idea of temple and sacred space and God dwelling among his people, all of that is part of this. In Leviticus chapter 18, the land, they have defiled the land, they have made the land unclean, and the land itself is vomiting them out.
Yeah.
And that's in Leviticus 18, where all the, adultery and immorality and bestiality and homosexuality and all the abominations, the Canaanites have practiced those things. And so they may not be the worst people, but definitely when you consider, God's design for the land, God's design for Israel, God's ultimate plans in salvation history, and even just this idea, this theology of sacred space and the influence that the Canaanites would have on Israel, all of that is part of, I think, the biblical rationale of what's going on here.
Yeah, I think part of what we have to sort of work out here is what is the actual objection, because sometimes people will just say, yeah, the Canaanites, quote unquote, genocide. Well, it's not genocide. That's not the issue, for the reasons that we just articulated. But then they still want to say, well, yeah, but it was men, women, and children. And so you say, well, okay, well, it's not a problem with warrior men, apparently. We see that all the time in war. Okay, well, what would be the issue with women? Well, women can be just as immoral. I don't see any issue. But really, it's the children. That's part of the piece here, too. It's like, were they to go in and kill children? And this brings up some interesting questions about Rahab as well. But, something you said a second ago that I thought was worth mentioning again, this notion of a culture being perpetuated through generational sin. And this idea, it's like, okay, if you've got generation after generation after generation that's producing God haters, Yahweh haters, hostile to God, that refuse to repent, and this is what's being perpetuated by this culture. What is God supposed to do here? I mean, just simply allow it on the basis of free will, or is God in sort of the right standing to come in and say, no, I'm going to put an end to this because I've got a greater plan and purpose salvifically in play. And this, to your point, is the time in which they're going to be judged. And I'm right to do so because this is a culture that has produced, like we might say with Nineveh, this is a culture that continues to produce not just, murder and these kinds of sins that we think of as being particularly egregious, but children that hate God.
Yeah, and child sacrifice. We haven't even mentioned child sacrifice, but we have cinerary urns from cemeteries at Tyre,
right,
that indicate Phoenician Canaanite people were practicing that. I think the last vestige of Canaanite culture was kind of Carthage in Africa. They were finally sort of defeated and in the 2nd century BC. And I know my daughter has been to you can still go to the Canaanite cemetery there and see the burial of where children were buried. And all of these things, God has something better in place. And all these things are coming together at the moment when Joshua leads the Israelites into Israel. Salvation history is moving forward in a new way, and I think we've got another couple of episodes where we can talk about things about the children and the language, kill everybody, wipe everybody out, and all those kinds of things. But I think here, at least we've been able to look a little bit more at kind of the rationale behind this and some of the reasons that are involved here.
It's good.
Yeah, well, thank you guys for finally getting to the point, I guess. But no, I know
It takes us a while.
This is a tough topic, and even though we're thousands of years removed, it's still a sensitive area for a lot of people that are reading the Old Testament sometimes maybe for the first time even. So, thank you guys, and for you guys, we got a few episodes left. It sounds like, so be back next week and dive on in with us. Thank you.